and welcome everybody to today's Coffee Talk. We're brewing better security because identity matters. And I'm super excited today to have a couple of real experts in this area join us and dive deeper into security. I'm Michael Downs. I'm the Chief Technology Officer for Evolving Solutions and the host of our Coffee Talk series. Again, thank you for joining us today. I always enjoy doing these, and the great team we have, I always get great conversations out of this too, so fantastic. Russ Staiger is our Principal Security Solutions Architect here at Evolving Solutions, and Ryan Vinje is joining us today for the first time as our Senior Security Solution Architect focused on identity. And with that, I'm going to dive in and ask you guys to introduce yourselves a little bit. Russ, can you maybe tell us, we've kind of met you before on a couple of podcasts. We recently talked about Mythos and Glasswing, and if people want to see that conversation, you can go out to the Evolving Solutions website or to our YouTube channel at Evolving Solutions. But that was a great conversation. But maybe if you can tell us a little bit about sort of your experience in the world of identity in the world of security.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think for those of us lucky enough to have been around for a couple decades of IT, it's been quite a wild ride. Identity, very simply, in the beginning was more of a business enabler. It was built around the idea that people needed to get access to internal business, file shares, applications, but it was really not thought of as necessarily a security control as much as a business enabler. So as threat existed in the early days, it was, hey, we need to keep attackers out of our networks or out of our business. Mm-hmm. And that was kind of an unquantified space. It was, are there network worms? Is it, people coming in, plugging into conference rooms, right? It was kind of a very nebulous attack surface. So as time went on, very clearly, attackers began to understand what are no longer veiled threats inside different ways that the business executes on just getting it done, right? So getting things to work. And organically, a lot of our IT organizations grew up over time to find that the instantiation of identity was oftentimes very unique to individual businesses, and that oftentimes left very unique problems. So today, through that evolution, identity has become a primary control in sort of the zero trust triad, right? It is one of the points at which we prognosticate the value of a specific identity or an entity and put that control in place. So as you look at that long arc, to wrap that all up, it is to say that identity, which was once part of just getting on the network and being able to have access to the things you need in a day, it has become part of the focus where we go and look for specific actualization of an identity's value, its security, its credentialed authenticity. That's kind of it in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's a great history. I appreciate you sharing that. At some point, well, maybe later in this conversation, we'll get back to a little bit around metrics and identity, because I know measuring and understanding metrics is a key piece of how you work with our clients. Also, I mentioned before, Ryan Vinje is joining us for the first time. Ryan, before you dive in and give us a little bit more context around identity and sort of what sort of happened with cloud and machine identities and now agentic AI and how that's affected identity, maybe give us a little bit of your background and how you got here, how you got to be involved so heavily with identity.
Yeah, I would say it started with my very first position, and I was an Active Directory and Group Policy Admin. And at the time, again, as Russ put it, this is back during black and white TV. Active Directory almost was the backbone of identity, so to speak, at the time. And that dictated access. And we would key on HR in terms of who should be there and, oh, hey, we have some accounts we should probably clean out. Yeah. Working through different technical roles and into technical leadership, identity for me never went away. It's always there. And so it might be working for an organization with multiple disjointed business units. When you think about that from an identity perspective, it becomes really difficult to manage, operating essentially a shared services IT org before the tools were really ready in the market. And for me as a specialty, I feel that identity security has been present in my career every single day. And to me, what makes it so interesting is its non-uniformity. Sure. It is ubiquitous everywhere. I've personally watched it move from a just a cost center of IT plumbing to a board level business risk. And I think it's been really fascinating to see that graduation of the topic with as a business enabler, not just a ones and zeros function. And I'll say last, it touches so many pieces of the enterprise. We're talking security, we're talking cloud, we're talking automation, SDLC, CI/CD, AI, and a number of other categories are touched in the process. So to me, it's this interesting nervous system that runs throughout any organization through identity.
So maybe that's a great starting point to maybe ask you to dive a little bit deeper into some of those more current trends. And for me, and for you're deeper in this than I am, but for me, the big change really started when we started talking about microservices architecture for applications, where all of a sudden things had to talk to each other through APIs. I needed an API key. I needed certain boundaries that went with that. And then you get to this agentic AI place, which brings a whole new world of challenge that goes with identity and what you need to think about in terms of identity. So Ryan, maybe if you can just elaborate on the new challenges that have come both with that sort of microservices approach in cloud, and then how that's morphed into agentic AI and the new threats that come with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Briefly, to me, the old way with non-human identity was just put that non-human identity into the human box and just replicate what you're doing. And certainly as that doesn't work, where non-human identities outnumber human identities by an orders of magnitude first. There is no HR system of record. There is no joiner, mover, leaver lifecycle to rely on. And I mean, even when you think about how to define this in audit is a task. And you alluded to it as well. We're authenticating on, keys, tokens, secrets, certificates, secret sprawl, is such an exposure in this space. Literally, I was on with a Fortune 100 customer just last week. Last time this key was rotated, 11 years ago. And that's how it goes. It's the amount of hygiene that we'll call it in the non-human identity space is significant. We're talking about ephemeral identity. It's one thing to have a workforce, and each individual has a relatively static access set. They can make requests, and those requests will be approved and then rescinded in due time. But how do we apply that to ephemeral, machine identity that's, running for 12 seconds? And how do we, ascribe ownership to maybe in a sub-agent that was spun up by an orchestration agent at the request of a human? This becomes so complex so quickly. I think part of our task is to pull this apart and simplify it. But in simplest terms, to me, the legacy world of basic service accounts that are persistent, that do sit there with their static passwords, and we rotate those from time to time, those days are in the rearview mirror. And right now, we're talking about terms such as jurisdiction, intent, and intent on behalf of a human or intent on behalf of another agent. I mean, these are hard questions to answer.
Yeah, and then that's just really fascinating. It's really changed the way that you need to take a security approach more broadly. Identity is certainly a piece that has now taken on new characteristics of this new world that we find ourselves in, or that we're actively participants in and making grow, frankly. And that piece of it is different. One of the things that, when we last talked, Russ, one of the things we talked about was that some of the AI threats are accelerating a problem that already existed, right? It's not a new threat, it's a named threat. It was sort of the tagline that I think we threw in with that. But part of what goes with that, of course, is how do you think about metrics? How do you think about advising a client more broadly? And a lot of what your role is, a lot of your engagement with clients is sort of that broader security approach. As you're having those conversations and you're thinking about identity in that broader security approach, what kinds of things do you advise clients to think about? Are there metrics that you integrate into that?
Yeah, so I mean, in a general sense, metrics that drove security years ago, or even in the recent past, were derived around the quantity of lift required to enable the environment to embrace security. So that might be number of accounts, number of certain activities we saw at the firewall, number of emails, so the certain pedigree or how much we blocked. And these were all just I guess, sort of the organization feeling out what it was, right? Like sort of understanding that attack surface for the real texture that that produced it. But today, the transition in metrics really is more about the quantification of how that attack surface actually represents real risk to the business, and I'll quantify that. So
Sure.
identity it's like the shift is more from being what we used to think of as standalone functions. So even today, in a lot of enterprise organizations, we still see identity functions being standalone in the sense that there's an identity access management group. Then there are some people who are really good at PAM, or privilege access management in an organization, or there are people who are really good in IGA or MFA, and those are kind of operate in their own space. They don't have a lot of shared insight with each other that allows the business to say this is kind of the projection of identity as a blended sense of sciences that tell us who we are, and in the scope of all things identity in our business. That is beginning to formally come together now. Organizations are saying we need to have, in the same way that we talk about data with DSPM, now an ISPM, which is sort of a grand wrangler of all of that insight to say, what is our identity threat writ large? And how do we drive numbers around that? So in some cases or senses, the metrics that drive identity today are hyper specific to the organization and the problem that they're facing at that time. And other ways, organizations that have become mature enough to actually begin to like collate all this identity sensor data and start to say, hey, what matters to us inside of this? While they will have very specific metrics that apply to them, the ability to quantify that attack surface will come across in things like accounts that have a specific type of activity based on a specific business unit, or a specific threat that exists out in the world, or it might be as obvious as things saying like, hey, can we detect mythos like pressures against our organization in our identity landscape? So it's becoming more specific, but it is also or more specific to the uniqueness of the business, but it is also becoming more capable, which I think is the big takeaway here, is that metrics up until now have been very isolated, as much as those security functions were standalone, again, like identity access management, PAM, IGA, lived in their own boxes. Now that they're coming together, we can talk about metrics that actually speak to the broad value of identity as implemented as a security control in an enterprise organization.
Oh, and that seems like a big leap forward. I mean, that's a broader trend that we're starting to see, where being able to pull sensor data or get visibility from across the organization to get more comprehensive metrics that actually talk about real risk and real threat. And one of the things that you highlighted, and that Ryan and I have had a couple conversations about, is there's a uniqueness to each organization, and in terms of their identity. There's, you and I, Ryan, have talked a bit about sort of a framework that you've thought through in terms of some pillars around identity, but each of those sort of traces back to the unique requirements of an individual organization. I'm wondering if you might be willing to elaborate a little bit on that approach.
Certainly. And yeah, to echo the context, from my perspective, you can have two organizations with two identical software stacks with wildly different implementations. Operationally, philosophically, and even just the simple drivers. Org A is pursuing every nuanced provisioning scenario possible. Org B responds to compliance and compliance only. Right. So to answer your question, I think what makes the space difficult right now is with how many vendors solve for it. And it makes sense, because there's so many lanes that define the space. We might be talking about workload identity, when we might be talking about provisioning and cross-organization trusts, and how does that work in identity. We might be having another conversation about credentials and delegation, and that on behalf of concept, and how do we even begin to measure that. Agentic, certainly. Then we get into authorization, and that runtime is a difficult puzzle to solve. And that's what we really need to do, and tying that to zero trust. And last, like I mentioned, how do you wrap governance and compliance around this space? And to answer your question directly, in my view, I do feel that it's a good opportunity to go back to basics, the fundamentals. And those fundamentals are the standards that define the space. And And so we have standards there now, but I think what's so important is that we're all chasing a moving target. And it's an important to say, to understand where that target is moving towards. For example, so many organizations were talking about MCP and what it does. It's the USB-C of AI, and it's so convenient. But what about the new standard coming out in just a few weeks' time of recording this video, and the largest authorization revision coming with it, and OAuth 2.1, aligned to OIDC, for example. We need to be ready for that. We want to be ready for AIMS, as well. Or, and again, we have standards such as SPIRE, SPIFFE, SDID. But what about WMSI? That's coming up next, and across domain trusts. And how is this going to all fit together? So the short version of this being that I feel that with the customers we are working with, we are not putting the period at the end of the sentence. We are capturing a point in time based on their exact position. And then we can start to track with these standards and have a very clear line of sight where they're moving towards, where the weak points are within the program, and tie those together.
So how do you then take that sort of, I love the not putting a period at the end of the sentence, right? We have to be able to continue to have the conversation. We need to be able to continue to look at what's happening and changing. What are some of the principles or foundational approaches that allow you to adapt then? What are the kinds of things you need to do that don't take you down a rabbit hole or take you down a channel to where you're going to end up stuck and off in one particular place? What are some of those principles that clients are seeking to be able to adapt to new standards? This next wave of standards you just talked about is not the last wave of standards.
No.
But it's the next wave, right? I wouldn't be surprised in 12 months from now we're talking about a whole new set of standards that address some of the challenges that have become apparent because of agentic. How do we position myself to be able to be secure now, but still deal with those on my ability to pivot when I need to?
Yeah, in conversations right now, what I'm finding is it comes down to a simple conversation to understand the unique tool set in a given organization, how the standards map to that given organization's tool set, understand any gaps in what's deployed and what's not. And from there, it becomes a pretty straightforward exercise in terms of, okay, let's say, for example, we want to be secretless by design. And here's what we have, here's where we need to go. And what ends up happening is the path forward becomes quite straightforward. But determining current state is the hard part. Even just establishing the estate is, having the right tools to even know, what's underneath this umbrella is a question too many organizations can't answer.
Sure.
And that's where we want to start, is really down at the foundation. And then from there, it's not really a templated conversation, because every organization is unique in their technical position, the compliance frameworks they need to answer to, and the gaps that may be between. And so to me, it's all about the existing stack, how it maps to the standards across the space. And then from there, understanding where they need to be, and then drawing a very clear line from here to there.
Yeah, and you hit on something I think is really important across everything we talk about in modern operations, which is discovery and visibility, and being able to tell what you actually have, how it's actually being used, and how things are integrated and talking to each other. And without that, there's no way you can make progress effectively, right? You can throw money at it, I can slap a tool on it, but I may have actually made my problem worse because I've created a new sense of security where I've actually created a vulnerability. That's a key piece of what we often talk about as we're talking about getting to a level of maturity in this modern operations kind of environment. Russ, I'm going to ask you to maybe elaborate on that a little bit. Ryan's really hitting on some of the things that need to happen in terms of discovery and identity. Open the aperture a little bit. What are some of the things that you're seeing about how that identity discovery, identity tools integrate with the rest of the security environment to sort of pull together a more holistic or comprehensive security posture?
Yeah, this is a great question. I mean, this is the big picture, obviously,
Right.
and how we stitch that together. One of the themes, I think, that if we think about that, we've kind of been hitting on, like, what's the historical change that identity has gone through? And one really important part of this is that we're also moving from a stance of where identity functions are not just about authentication or authenticating people to the network. It's about verification, right?
Mm-hmm.
Verifying the identities that rest behind those, whether they're non-human or they're the workforce we've always expected. Validating who those are has never been more important for a
Mm-hmm.
variety of different threat actor forces or just, institutional needs. So when we think about the power of that verification process and what those identities are allowed to do with that, we start to see where those tie into things like, an additional, use of that zero trust triad in the network sense, saying from a network perspective, what are you allowed to do? And then from the data side, what data are you allowed to access, and how is that either increasing or decreasing the risk for the organization? And do the controls that we put over these different, visibilities and control points, is that hampering, or is it transparent to the business because it's being done in a way that is an accelerator or enabler without really impacting, the workforce? We need to think about identity as maintaining its ability to be seamless across all of these previously standalone experiences, but also seamless in the way that it interacts or approves network or data activity. And that's where we start to see that this triad becomes a singular object, right? A polygon of risk mitigation.
Mm-hmm.
And inside that idea is where we, as an integrator at Evolving Solutions, this is the conversation that we drive with our clients. Where we stand out is, how do we begin to take the nuanced signal data of all of those different, visibilities, the data, network, and identity, and then all of their sub-disciplines, and derive a constant state of awareness that says, not only do we have all this conditional awareness of what's happening in our environment, but we can enforce conditionally against it in ways that are appropriate for specific types of risks, or specific business units, or specific degrees of privacy, perhaps, or data sensitivity. That's really where we are headed, because it is just now, like in the big picture, that these tools and network data and identity are finally becoming rich enough in what they can see and the places that they can reach, for us to begin to be very surgical in the way that we attach this. Because up until now, a lot of the approaches we've had have been, unfortunately, very commodity. And identity is unique in the sense that it is an expression of the unique organic growth an organization's had to get where it is. So when we go in, we definitely need Ryan Vinjes to come in and be, sort of the shaman or high talking chief of reason that bring experience to this. Lots of the other things that happen in security are very, they benefit from commodity plays like EDR and firewalls, right? Bulk offloads of risk. But identity is a very specific science to each unique organization. And within that application of that inside the triad of zero trust, there's a ton of opportunity for how identity can be employed to increase data security or increase data access, provisioning. But at the same time, it is completely constrained by the ability to bring experience to the table in that story, and also be able to do the discovery that maps out what the totality of that universe that really needs contention, being contended with. That's really the challenge. And I think organizations run into this and experience at first some degree of shock at how much is actually required to get this kind of visibility discovery process, and then inventory all of the opportunities for identity implementation, and then develop a plan. And that's why we feel we have something very unique.
Yeah, well, that's awesome. I also love that in that conversation, you highlighted identity as both a spiritual discipline, as a shaman, and a scientific discipline. All in the, it has to cover the whole gamut, because it sort of seems to be a little bit of it is a little bit of everything. It is unique. And so part of what I wanted to ask you too, Ryan, is, can you give me maybe an example of a client that you've worked with recently where you helped them build that roadmap, help them do that kind of prioritization and discovery that Russ sort of just touched on?
Of course, and I would echo a point Russ made. Yep. Yeah, I would echo a point made that so often, these signals are disjointed from one product to the next within an organization. And so the ability to orchestrate amongst them is one of the first places to start.
Yeah.
But to me, to get started, here's what I would say is customers, identity teams, like so many, are being asked to do more with less. Mm-hmm. And so few have time to stop the clock to take these really deep dive point of views to understand precisely where their program is in terms of deployment versus purchase, ROI left on the table, and going past that, then getting into futures and not just a here to there of the current owned stack, but then we get into goal states. I would say that none of which I just described is difficult to do. Teams have time finding the time to answer these questions, and that's where we can help. We can bring some a very sharp edge of know-how to answer these quickly without an onerous amount of time being consumed to do so. And in customer conversations, what I'm finding is, as soon as we shine a light in these places that just no one has paused to look at, the answers are quite clear, out of the gate in terms of where the opportunity for success is within the program, and we proceed from there.
No, fantastic. And I think that falls into the rest of our approach, which is we can show you the landscape of where you need to improve. We need to take your unique financial skills, tools, software, investment decisions into consideration, as well as your risk profile and your business needs, to be able to help make good recommendations and good suggestions about how you ought to move forward in order to get to the state that you'd like to be at. Any final thoughts, Ryan? Anything we ought to think about that we haven't maybe touched today that you'd encourage folks as they're going on their identity journey? Obviously, we'd love to have folks reach out to us. We'd love to get into a conversation, because I think there's benefit in having a perspective of a group like Evolving, who's worked with a variety of clients and has a set of expertise. But any thoughts that you would leave the viewers with?
Yeah, I'd say from an identity perspective, the organizations with strong fundamentals, now will absorb the new standards later with the least amount of friction. And we can help to take that abstract statement and make it more objective based on a given customer's environment.
I love that. Russ, any final thoughts from you?
Just to mirror that a bit, I guess to remember that identity in the old school was an authentication service, and today, as we talk about this being not an enabler as much as a security focus, it is the enterprise's universal trust layer, and that's what makes it a participant in the triad of zero trust. And for leaders who are listening to this, it's first important to grasp that concept that it is this universal trust layer, but that locking it down or understanding it, quantifying it, and beginning to apply some real science to your identity reality is not just maybe a great first step, but a absolutely fundamental step, to Ryan's point, for the zero trust conversation. If you're not doing that today, reach out. We're happy to help.
Oh, and I think the other point that I would leave us with too is the comment that you made, Ryan, and that you emphasized, Russ, is the foundation is what the companies that have the foundation in place are the companies that are going to be able to pivot to take care of, to deal with both compliance and regulatory changes, but also, as importantly, or perhaps more importantly, threat changes as things start to show up that maybe we hadn't envisioned before because of new capabilities that are in the IT environment. Well, it wouldn't be a coffee talk if I didn't spend a minute talking about coffee. So everybody knows today I'm drinking a little bit of Driftless, a blend from a roaster in Wisconsin that is really delightful. And as always, I'm happy to send you a pound of coffee beyond any other benefits. If you want to get into a conversation with Ryan or Russ, or if you're an Evolving Solutions customer now with one of your account, reach out to your account executive. I'm happy to do that for you. I know, Russ, from our previous conversation, you're kind of a mushroom coffee guy.
Yeah, the Rise coffee. Yes. Love it. Yeah.
And Ryan, tell me about your coffee journey. We were talking a minute ago.
Oh, you know what? It started with an AeroPress and a lot of temperature testing and graduated later into where now I'm spoiled and I walk downstairs and there's cold press ready to go. So I have a better half that is the master of the science in our house.
I love it. Well, thank you everybody for joining today. I really appreciate the time that you spend with us. If you would like to dive a little bit more deeply into Mythos and Glasswing, we have a recording of a coffee talk that Russ and I did along with Nick Boye, one of our security architects, around Mythos and Glasswing and how those impact your environment, things to think about. You can find that on our website or on our YouTube channel. And if you are interested in having a conversation with either of these fine folks or anyone else on our security team, we're super happy to make that happen. You can always reach out to your account executive if you're a current Evolving Solutions customer, or you can email at us at info@evolvingsol.com, and we'll be happy to set that up. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today.